Hi guys, welcome back to Kama Mahako Central, Author Central. I'm going to begin this new book, The Fighter in the Family. Now, look carefully at this man on the cover. That's my granddaddy. That's my grandpa, Mr. Natty. Yeah, I use this picture for the cover of my book. And that baby in his arms, that's my baby sister. Alright, so this it's not a true story though, but it's based on a man and his grandchild, his granddaughter, and the relationship that they developed, So he reminded me, I would say the character was based on my grandfather. My grandfather was very dear to me, very, very dear to me. So that's his picture. Again. Alright, so let me read the blurb. The Fighter in the Family. Second novel in the series Brave Young Minds. I had the best of hopes for him and he died, and I had the worst of hopes for her and she survived. What is the lesson in that? This is the question that Nathaniel poses to his friend Clarence after life forces him into introspection. The death of his infant son Juju plunges Nathaniel into a 30-year depression and a morbid preoccupation with death. He abandons his beloved farm in Walker's Wood for the slums of Kingston. Ultimately, he chastises God, whom he refers to as Mr. Spiteful, for taking Juju, the one boy who was willing to stay on the farm and feed the nation. But is Nathaniel blaming the wrong guy for Juju's death? Is he the one who is to be blamed and not Mr. Spiteful? I lost a child too, says Hortense, Nathaniel's wife. It is well known what happens to a woman after she loses a child. A part of her dies with that child. The other part of her wobbles through life on autopilot. Eventually, she may even learn to laugh again. But what happens to a man when he loses his beloved boy? Alright, so we're going to dive into the mind of Nathaniel. And Nathaniel was actually the name of my granddaddy. I told you this book was about my granddaddy. It's not a true story, but the character was inspired by my grandfather, whose name was Nathaniel, like this character. And the dedication, the book is dedicated to Nathaniel and Hortense. That's my granddaddy and my grandmama. Alright, so I'm going to read chapter 1. When morning broke in Walker's Wood, the moment was precious. The very hills seemed to brace themselves up to touch the crimson sky, arching their backs, their green bodies solemn amidst the mooing of cows. There had been pitch darkness and the village had been remarkably still. Then all of a sudden a dazzling flicker streamed over the undulations and caressed the sides of the hills. And in a flash, an entire new day was alive and kicking. What's more, it had rained last night and the earth was still smelling sweet from her bath, and she had dabbed herself with the perfume from the thyme and the peppermint and the rose bushes. There were still tiny droplets of rain on the leaves and on the blades of grass, but the place wasn't soggy. The slopes had drained well during the night. Ever since he was a boy, Nathaniel had made it his point of duty to be there at this moment, outside in the fields that he loved, to witness the return of the dawn. He rose at 4, usually did a bit of weeding or watering, though most people would have found it too dark to do anything of the sort. But Nathaniel knew where everything was, and he could find his way around those fields with a crocus bag over his head. This was his land. His father had left it to him. It was his to keep and to care for and to nurture and to pass on to his sons when the time came. True, he didn't have a son yet, but Tulsi was 7 months pregnant, and Nathaniel knew it would be a boy, a farmer like him. Nathaniel put his spade down, for he had been doing a bit of plowing, nothing heavy, just turning her over the soil by where the okras were growing, so the earth would be more receptive to the compost that he had brought. He dug his hand into the load of compost in the wheelbarrow. The thing smelled so good and was so rich and flaky and black and full of goodness that it made Nathaniel smile to himself. He was kind of stooping, stirring the compost into the soil with his fingers and gently easing the stalk of the okras out of the way, and at the same time gazing in wonder at the morning sky and listening to Bruce's cow mooing in the short distance. It was Sunday morning. At about 6 o'clock, by which time the whole valley was clear and the roosters had just about done with crowing, and here and there about the place you were beginning to hear faint murmurs of people stirring in their houses, Nathaniel took out his thermos full of cocoa tea and poured some into a mug. Hortense had made the cocoa herself, roasted and pounded the dark brown cocoa seeds into the creamy powder after she and Nathaniel had plucked them from their oval pods and sucked the sweet, tangy flesh from them. She always filled his thermos, sometimes even from the night before, so he could have his tea to take with him down into the fields in the mornings. Always drink some hot tea before first thing a morning, Hortense would say, clear away the gas off his stomach. Nathaniel agreed. He could never feel right starting the day without his cocoa tea. A little way off, Nathaniel could see Bruce, his older brother by 3 years, struggling with the goats, trying to persuade them to feed further up the slope close to his house, rather than down in the gently sloping valley where they preferred to be and where they seemed intent on going, Bruce or no Bruce. He was off to a late start as usual, and not only because today was Sunday. Bruce was off to a late start every morning. Unlike Nathaniel, Bruce hated farming. He had not wanted to be a farmer at all. He would have you know, he was only in this farming business because at the moment, nothing else had come his way. But things were in the pipeline waiting to happen. Bruce would be stepping up in life soon and very soon. You'd better put that in your pipe and smoke it. For some reason not yet fully understood, Bruce had decided not to go into crop cultivation, like Nathaniel had, but to venture into livestock rearing instead. But he hated animals. He loved pigs and cows and goats and chickens when they were baked or fried or roasted over an open fire, dressed with some jerk sauce or sprinkled with some Scotch bonnet pepper, served with half a dozen dumplings or some rice and peas. The only time Bruce loved looking at goats was when they were in a tin pan of piping hot mannish water, when you could smell the onions and the garlic and the thyme from miles away. And he loved chickens when they laid dozens of eggs to eat with his sausage, and when they grew fat and juicy for Sunday dinner, so he could get a juicy drumstick to bite into and suck on. Other than that, Bruce hated animals. He couldn't stand them. They were noisy and smelly, and contrary to popular opinion, not at all cute. And he especially hated having to wake up so early on a Sunday morning, at the ungodly hour of 8 o'clock, when all the normal men he knew were sleeping, and would still be sleeping for hours yet, resting in preparation for a good evening of dominoes later. He was tugging at the goats, and the goats were trying to tug him into the valley, and the goats were winning. "Ah, Bruce," Nathaniel shouted, raising the thermos to indicate that Bruce should come up for some tea when he was finished with the goats. "Ah, Mas Natty," Bruce shouted back. Though they were brothers, they had very different views on life, and different ways of going about things, and a heated fuss between the two of them was not at all uncommon. Nathaniel did have a nasty temper when he was ready, and he didn't like lazy, scornful people. He respected a man who was willing to plunge his two hands into the red St. Anne soil with a good whiff of the horse manure hitting against the inside of his nostrils, the wonderful manure that was used to charm the crops into growing. Nathaniel respected a man who didn't mind getting soaking wet when the cool St. Anne rains streamed down in the afternoons, and you were caught heading home with a bunch of green bananas on your head and a crocus bag in your hands, full of coconuts. Oh my! He loves farming. Bruce eventually allowed the goats to have their own way, and he tied them further down into the valley where they could get at the good stuff that they had seen growing down there, which they had been trying to tell him from a long time. He came over to Nathaniel, plopped down heavily, and poured himself some tea in Nathaniel's empty mug. "Ah, this cocoa tea good," said Bruce, and Nathaniel told him that Hortense had roasted and pounded the beans herself. "Myrtle never yet make anything this good," Bruce commented. And he made a mental note to take up the matter with Myrtle when he got back to the house and find out why it was that she had never seen fit to roast and pound cocoa beans when Hortense had taken to doing so. "What a piece of rain last night though," Nathaniel said. "Though you wouldn't believe it the way the place dried down quick. Powerful rain in the night and powerful sun in the morning. It keep the plants singing and happy." "Ah," Bruce agreed, but he was not keen on the idea of having to be out there when the grass was still damp and slippery. Don't care what the plants said about it. They say it was a system over us, but it passed and gone. "More to come, man, more to come," Nathaniel chanted briskly. "It's rainy time now, more to come." "I wouldn't mind if it hold off a bit," Bruce said, sipping. "I can't take too much rain all at once. The pig pen's so blasted mucky." That reminded Nathaniel that he wanted to have a word with Bruce about the fencing he had made around the cow pastures. For a couple weeks now, the cows had been straying onto Nathaniel's side of the land, because the fencing on one side had just about collapsed flat. "When you're going to fix the fence, Mass Bruce?" "Just yesterday, 3 more cows come over, and they trample on everything and eat whatever they want of my crops, and not one of them made any mention of payment." Nathaniel chuckled, though he had not meant to try to be funny, for he knew that Bruce would seize every opportunity not to take the matter seriously. "Soon fix it, man," Bruce said, a bit annoyed. He knew that Nathaniel was about to offer to help him mend the fence, which would force Bruce to have to commit himself to doing the thing, and he wasn't ready, and he didn't quite look like being forced. That was the trouble with Nathaniel, always wanting to fix things before the appointed time. "I can help you mend it if you want," Nathaniel said. "It won't take too much to do. If we start earlier morning, we can finish by noon." "Going down to Ochia morning," Bruce lied. He hadn't planned to go to Ocheria's tomorrow, but now he figured he may as well go and see what was up in the city. "We could do it Tuesday then, early Tuesday morning," Nathaniel said, with a finality of tone and manner that warned Bruce not to try to wheel himself out of this one. "Tuesday then," Bruce replied. He stood to go. He wondered what Myrtle was fixing up for Sunday breakfast. Bruce was sure he could smell some roasted breadfruit with ackee and saltfish, stirred in some onions and garlic and sweet pepper, and maybe some fried dumplings too. Or perhaps the smell was coming from Nathaniel's house. Bruce heaved himself wearily up the slope. He was wearing his sneakers, the ones he had bought in Ocheria's, and he was trying his best not to get them messy. He didn't know why he hadn't left the damn goats right beside the house to make do with whatever shrubs or wild bushes were growing there. People had a saying that goats would eat just about anything. Why wouldn't these blasted goats live up to their reputation? Those goats of his were just too damn uppity. Nathaniel pulled off his water boots and left them on the veranda. He would soon need them again. He was only stopping for breakfast. He entered the house through the side door that led straight into their bedroom from the veranda, and Hortense was there, getting ready to go to morning service. She had on her hat and her church dress, and had been gathering her bag and things. Nathaniel slumped down on the chair beside the bed, took out his handkerchief, and wiped away some sweat. It was the first day they were seeing each other. It was the first they were seeing each other up close for the morning. He admired Hortense's belly, the way it curved and bulged out, like it wanted to burst the seams of her dress. It was not a tight dress, but the belly was big and pointed. Some people had even said that it seemed like the baby had turned already, and it was only the 7th month. Nathaniel wasn't sure what that meant, but as Hortense had blushed and rubbed her belly when the people said it, he figured that it was a good sort of news. It made him feel proud to know that his boy was already a big achiever in life, turning in his mother's belly when it was only the 7th month. Nathaniel wasn't sure exactly what month it was that babies were supposed to turn, or what exactly this turning business involved, but he knew they didn't normally do it at 7 months like his boy. Hortense loved floral print dresses. This morning, she had on a bright peach dress with even brighter roses, small and fluffy, dabbing the peach background and she had a floral hat to match. In fact, Nathaniel looked about the room and discovered that almost everything was floral, from the curtains to the bedspread to the cushions to Hortense's tie head folded on the chair. Hortense loved flowers and fruits, everything that grew really. She had made her own kitchen garden, not far from the house, and she had a green thumb too. She had embroidered doilies with strawberries and mangoes and apple shapes, and the plastic placemats on the table were brightly colored and printed with bountiful fruit. Everywhere about the house, from the kitchen to the bathroom, to the bedroom to the hall, were pictures and hangings and newspaper advertisements that had been cut out, all decked with the colorful bounty of nature. "You're off to church," Nathaniel said to his wife. He knew she was off to church. He had just wanted to say something. "Yes," Hortense replied, "your tea is on the table." When she said tea, she really meant his entire breakfast, which was slices of roasted breadfruit with ackee and saltfish, 2 pieces of yam, and cocoa tea in the pot on the stove for him to reheat. Sometimes tea meant tea, sometimes it meant breakfast. "Later, Natty," Hortense said, "soon come back." "Walk good," Nathaniel told her, which in his particular language meant, "Take care and don't let anybody rub their hands over my boy, especially now that he has turned." I love Nathaniel. I am in love with this little old man. Alright. The room that they called the hall was really the living room, and the dining room too, for that's where the table was, where they ate their meals most times. It was a big hall. Nathaniel's father had had a good amount of money and had built this big wooden house from as far back as the late 1930s, more than a decade before Nathaniel, or Bruce for that matter, had been born. There were only 2 bedrooms, a hall and a kitchen, but the rooms were very big. There was a veranda out front, and in later years, an indoor bathroom had been added, though there were still the outdoor shower and pit latrine around the back of the house. Nathaniel raised the plastic mesh that Hortense had used to cover his food, and immediately the aroma hit him. In fact, he had smelt it from before he entered the house, while he was climbing up the slope, but now the smell was even richer and more inviting. He dived in, eating heartily a well-deserved breakfast after having been plowing away in the fields from the crack of dawn. He had worked up a good strong appetite. When he had nearly cleared his plate, Nathanael went into the kitchen and lit the coal stove. It took him a little while to get the coals glowing, but soon the tea was hot. There was more ackee and saltfish in the dutchy pot. They would have this for their lunch. He carried the cup of tea and what remained of his food out onto the veranda where he sat. This veranda was the very best veranda in Walker's Wood, Nathanael thought. He would challenge any man who wanted to compare their veranda to his at this moment. It was the very best veranda because, being right smack dab along the highway, you could look across the rolling fields and see for about 2 miles in one direction, where the road coiled towards the Fern Gully, and in the other direction, where you couldn't see too far because of the hills, where the road coiled coming from Monique. The only thing was the exhaust and the damn honking of the horns sometimes, eager as they were to get to Ocho Rios, or much farther on to Falmouth or Montego Bay, which was where a good plenty of them were usually headed. But the view was excellent. On the other side of the highway across the road, on land still belonging to Nathanael, he could survey his acres of pimento trees. This was pimento country, and Nathanael had at least 30 trees. They were the legacy of his father, Jonas Hector, who had started life as a humble fisherman in Ocho Rios when it was still a sleepy little town, and had had the enterprise to purchase a piece of land in Walker's Wood. By the time he died at the age of 53, had the enterprise to purchase a piece of land in Walker's Wood, which grew and grew and prospered, so that by the time he died at the age of 53, he had left a sizable estate for his 3 children. As Bruce had nothing but a fleeting interest in the land, and as Hilda, their sister, had deserted to Kingston years ago, Nathanael considered himself sole proprietor of the estate. It was a duty he proudly took upon himself, and which none of his siblings really objected to, except to say that a portion of it was still legally theirs, and by extension their children's, and that Nathanael should share whatever profits came from it, though he did much of the planning and cultivating and maintenance himself. But he didn't mind. He loved being out in those fields. When the mangoes were ripe, or the callaloo stalks were fully grown, or the pepper crop came in, Hortense took them to the market in Ochi to sell. She had a stall there. She sold a good number of things, but mainly herbs and spices. She hardly ever slept in the market like some of the other women did, and Hortense only sold there 2 or 3 times a week. On those days, very early in the morning, Hortense would have already cooked Nathanael's lunch and left it in the dutchy pot on the stove, or she would pack his little bickle in a bag with some lemonade, or she would take it with him so he could take it with him into the fields and have lunch right there. But Hortense had stopped selling for a while, since she was heavily pregnant. She had stopped when she had reached 5 months. Nathanael figured Hortense would be away at church for about 3 hours. The actual service, he understood, took about 2 hours. But there was always hugging and greeting and chatting afterwards, and pulling each other over to the side to catch up on the events of the week, and to find out whose goat had dropped kid, and whose blood pressure had gone up, and whose son had passed exams, and whose granddaughter was coming for a visit from foreign. Then there was the waiting in turn to take Pastor to a private corner and squeeze a little something into his hand, different from what they had put in the collection plate or in tithes. Sometimes somebody had brought snacks, maybe gizzards or coconut cakes or blue draws, and there was a little picnic set up, so that the congregation could eat. And of course, there was always some elder to visit in the community who was sick and lonely and needed cheering, some baby mother to look for, and all that kind of thing. And as Hortense was a very sociable woman and kind-hearted, she would be out for quite a while today. Nathaniel himself was not a religious man, but he was on good terms with God. He was not sure who God was, how he was, or where he was, but he knew God must have been there somewhere, and he also knew that they were on good terms with each other. When Bruce had been a much younger man, roughly 22 or thereabouts, he had taken to going around preaching, saying that he had received the calling. Bruce joined a church and got baptized, and stayed a confirmed Christian for a good 5 months without backsliding. But during that time, he had tried to convince Nathaniel over to the Lord. He had tried to win Nathaniel over to the Lord, and they had read a chapter a day together, and Nathaniel had been inspired by the whole thing. But he never saw need to actually go to church or to sing hymns, or even to pray like Hortense did every night. He and God had worked out a little agreement that they were going to skip the fanfare, skip the praying and the singing and the chanting of strange words, and just get right to the point where they both understood that they were on the same side and on good terms. What was God? Nathaniel wasn't sure. For starts, he had some ideas about what God wasn't. Take, for example, a hurricane. God could not have caused hurricanes, surely, which toppled houses and demolished farms that people had worked so hard and flexed so much muscle to build and to cultivate. He was sure God could not have played any part in such a thing. But he figured the devil may have had a hand in it. And God wasn't the one who had cast down the lightning bolt that had struck his father Jonas, struck him down flat in his field and killed him on the spot. That could not have been God. Those sorts of things were the work of the devil. It was also the devil who caused spirits to go about at night scaring people, and to hold Nathaniel down when he was lying on his back on the bed sometimes. As to what God had to have been involved with, Nathaniel had a few ideas also. God must have caused the sprouts to ease their tender selves out of the soil. He must have caused the stalks to swell with green juice and the leaves to stiffen sharp with life. God must have caused that sweetness to gather in the soft orange flesh of mangoes and the tang of oranges, and it was surely without a doubt God's water in the belly of coconuts. And of course, for so many months, God must have caused the boy to turn so early, getting ready to come into the world and see his mama and papa. Nathaniel wondered if the boy would look like him. More than likely he would, for Nathaniel had sharp features, which he himself had gotten from his father. Nathaniel, Bruce, and Hilda were all the spit and image of their father, extremely tall with angular faces, and they all spoke like him, fast and strong. Their mother had died giving birth to her fourth child, who had been a girl, and the child had died too 3 days later. Nathaniel didn't remember his mother very well. His father had pretty much raised them by himself in the early years, and then he had remarried. Nathaniel knew he wanted to be a good father to his boy, and he knew that Hortense would be a good mother. When Nathaniel put his water boots back on and went down into the fields, he found that 2 of Bruce's calves had wandered down and had gotten stuck in the mud that had formed in a shallow puddle due to the rain. He hollered for Bruce but got no response, and Nathaniel had to help the calves out himself. But he decided there and then that Tuesday would not pass before the fence was fixed. He spent almost the entire day working, and then he went up to the house and relaxed with Hortense. A gentle breeze was coming over the hills. It was cool on the veranda, so cool that they stayed there till evening and had dinner there. In the night, Hortense brought out a basin with mangoes and started packing them down. Bruce was coming up through the gate from off the highway, coming from his domino games. "Hold dog," he shouted, out of habit, knowing that the dogs were quite familiar with him. He climbed onto the veranda. Nathaniel was shelling gungo peas, and there was a box of corn beside him on the floor, to be husked. Surprising everyone, Bruce took up one of the corns and started to strip the ears from it. He must have been half drunk, because he hardly ever helped to do such things. "Night, night," Bruce said, sitting on the side wall of the veranda. "Betsy and Mildred got loose today," Nathaniel told Bruce. "They got stuck in the mud and I had to pull them out. We have to fix the fence no later than Tuesday." Bruce said he agreed. Tuesday it was then. Hortense was biting into her mangoes. These ones that she had in her bowl tonight, the hairy and blacky mangoes, were called common mangoes, but Hortense preferred these. "Mind worms, Miss Hortense. Can't see them too good in the twilight." "Ah, worms are the best. Worms are the least, Mass Bruce," Hortense said. "I eat mangoes with or without worms." The juice was running down her hands and Hortense was enjoying herself. Suddenly, she felt something and did her face the way she always did at such times, so that Nathaniel knew that the boy had kicked. He swelled with pride. All through that night, Hortense felt more and more kicks, stronger and more frequent, which made Hortense wonder if her time had really come. But she was only in her 7th month. "The boy can't wait," said Nathaniel. "He's anxious to come out and get started with life. Plant some yam and some banana and thing. I well know the feeling." The next morning, Hortense sent him to fetch the midwife, Mrs. Gordon, because Hortense was sure that something was happening, though this was her first child and she wasn't sure what to expect. Indeed, Mrs. Gordon confirmed that Hortense was in labor. Apparently, there had been some miscalculation on Hortense's part, or maybe the child was just impatient. Hortense would give birth before the day was done. Nathaniel felt useless and awkward waiting around the house, so he decided to go about his farming as usual, and left word that they should send Bruce to call him if anything. He busied himself with all manner of things, but he kept glancing up in the direction of the house, looking to see if Bruce was coming to fetch him. 3 times he could swear he heard the boy crying, and 3 times he nearly bolted up the hill, but it turned out to be only the goats, bleating out loud in midday contentment. Blasted goats, like they had nothing better to do than to mess with a man's head. Nathaniel ate his pickle and went on picking ripe capsicum peppers, eating some of them as he went along. It had been his habit since he was very young to toss one pepper after another into his mouth, with seeds and all, and chew and swallow, while steam puffed from every hole in his body. At 3 o'clock, Nathaniel could take it no longer. He was sure the boy must have come by now. Nathaniel started to make his way up the slope. He had a cutter of dried banana leaves and used it to cushion his head, and on this he balanced a bunch of green bananas. He held 3 jellies by their stems in one hand, for Hortense would be in need of coconut water to help her milk to come, and in his other hand he held his cutlass. He had almost reached the top of the hill, the top of the knoll, when Bruce suddenly pushed his head out from behind the corner of the house and shouted very loudly, for he thought Nathaniel was still way down in the valley. "The head just come!" Nathaniel put down the bananas and dropped the cutlass and the jellies and darted into the house. The midwife stopped him in his tracks when he had gotten to the hall and marched him off to wash his hands and change his clothes. "Is a boy," she announced, beaming at Nathaniel, who beamed back like a pleased puss. Of course it's a boy, Nathaniel thought. Hadn't he always said so? End of chapter 1. End of chapter 1. I'm going to enjoy this book so much. I love Nathaniel. Please stay with me as I continue reading from the book The Fighter in the Family.